Okay, well, if we're ready to go, I'd like to welcome you to the session on Invisibility and Violence, Gendered Issues in a COVID-19 World. My name is Pat O'Connor, Professor Pat O'Connor. I'm a Professor Emeritus from the University of Limerick and a visiting professor at the Geary Institute, UCD. I'd like to introduce the other speakers. Orla O'Connor, who's no relation, right? Okay, who's Director of the National Women's Council and who'll focus on policy issues. And Sarah Benson, who's CEO of Women's Aid, who'll talk about practice issues. So we're all new to this technology. As you can see, the technology has problems at times, nothing to do with us. So bear with us if there are glitches. I need to tell you that comments, questions should be sent via chat using the chat button to me as chair, and I'll basically pass them on to the other speakers. The format is that we'll be on this session for about 80 minutes, and each of us will speak for about 10 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be spent on discussion, answering questions, etc. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off, right? So I want to suggest that this crisis, COVID-19, is a critical or a fateful moment in Giddens' terms. Giddens, a famous sociologist. And he talks about these fateful or critical moments as a moment when routines are disrupted. And when there is, what he says is a return of the repressed. I want to argue that gender is one of the frameworks that has been repressed and that has been reactivated at this moment, this crisis, this fateful moment. And so at this fateful moment, we are able to see gendered perspectives which affect decision making. And I think this is important because it enables us to really take action to ensure that these do not continue. So I want to make 4 points in the minutes at my disposal, okay? And I want to, the first point, to highlight various aspects of this gendered framework, this repressed gendered framework. And the first of these points is that I want to argue that men's fun must not be disrupted. This point was elucidated, illuminated, revealed by what happened surrounding Cheltenham. Cheltenham was basically, it's a racing fixture in the UK calendar, 16th to the 20th of March. At the time it occurred, there were basically, schools had been closed, creches closed, universities closed. We're not sure how many, but it's been estimated between 10 and 20,000 people, mostly men, went to Cheltenham. And at that time, there was coronavirus in Cheltenham, and it has been described as a petri dish. People came back, they went back to their homes, communities, and obviously some of them were infected and some of them passed that on. The second example of this is the Irish-Italian rugby match, which was due to be held on the 14th of March. In fairness to Simon Harris, he cancelled the match and was roundly criticised for it. I have no relationship, I'm not any relation to Simon Harris, by the way, but he was criticised and there was no attempt made to do anything about the Italian supporters, many of whom had bought airline tickets and who came anyway to have basically a fun weekend in Dublin, despite the fact that they were coming from the north of Italy, which was at that time the hotspot as regards COVID-19. But yet the framework, the gender framework, which is repressed, was that really men's fun shouldn't or couldn't be disrupted. The second point I want to make is around the support of parents, particularly mothers, because they are the people who are the main, frequently do in Ireland most of the childcare work. And the failure to support these people, women, and some men who were key workers and who also had children who were parents. And the National Public Emergency Team to this day has put no supports in place for these people, even though it has stressed the importance of having key workers in the healthcare area. The idea, the image, the stereotype that key workers are basically people who have full-time carers at home. That seems to be what has ruled. Now, other countries, of course, have had the same problem, and the first thing they did, such as Norway, Australia, was to put in place arrangements to help support those key workers who were parents. And of course, the situation was exacerbated by the fact that creches and schools were closed at that time, have been closed since the 12th of March, and also that there were, the third point I'm going to make, this protection or cocooning of grandparents. So this third point is around the protection of women. Now, there was a recognition early on that vulnerability was related to age in the context of COVID-19. But instead of tackling the most obvious problem, which was frail elderly people in nursing homes, residential care centres, people in their 80s who had poor health, where social distancing was very difficult, instead of tackling that, the National Public Health Emergency Team decided on cocooning, inverted commas, the 70-plussers. On the HSE website, it is clearly stated that over 70s, even if they're fit and well, should not, the word is, do not go outside your home and garden. So effectively, the National Public Health Emergency Team was requiring 70-plussers not to even take exercise, a walk around within a 2-mile kilometre of their area. This is obviously likely to have consequences for their mobility, with consequences for falls, consequences in terms of heart attacks, strokes, and obviously consequences then for needing to access ICU. Now, we know that what the dangers are for people in nursing homes and residential care centres. As of yesterday, 62% of those who died due to COVID-19 were residents of nursing homes or residential care centres, 62%. We don't know what proportion of the deaths were to 70-plussers without underlying conditions living on their own. I suggest, and I can explain in the discussion afterwards where I'm speculating, the figure might be about 8%. So the National Public Health Emergency Team, when faced with the choice of actually dealing with potential 62% in nursing homes, residential care centres, or dealing with the risks to themselves and to the community posed by 70-plussers walking around their 2-kilometre radius, they chose to focus on the effective imprisonment, there's no other way to put it, of 70-plussers. And this decision obviously is likely to have consequences. And at one level, it's very difficult to say why this decision was made. And I think it only makes sense in the context of a focus on, quote, the protection of women. And there is a tradition, which does us no credit, that in the face of fateful or crisis moments, the solution, the Irish solution, seems to be to reach for basically the imprisonment of women, the incarceration of women. You need only think of the Magdalen laundries. So the fourth point I want to make is that from basically, again, from March, the focus has been on staying home. The National Public Health Emergency has stressed staying home, implicitly suggesting that, and explicitly suggesting that to be safe, you must stay home, and that being at home, you are safe. Of course, that ignores the fact that 1 in 4 women are not safe in their own homes, that in fact 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence. And so effectively, the state has colluded with the idea that home is a safe place, and effectively colluded with coercive controlling men. So what I've been saying is that this crisis moment, this fateful moment, has revealed a repressed framework. That framework is a gendered framework which focuses on men's fun above privileging it above all considerations, fails to recognize that women can be key workers and parents. It basically, by focusing their initial response on perceived vulnerability of the elderly, they chose within that to focus on the total imprisonment of perfectly fit 70-plussers and up to 5 days ago, to ignore the needs of those who are frail and already confined to nursing homes. And the last point, that seeing the home as a place of safety, one where violence does not occur, has effectively colluded with coercive controlling adults. So the National Public Health Emergency Team, I'd want to say they have got some things right, but many of the things they haven't got right have, I suggest, reflected this return of the repressed gendered framework. And by becoming aware of it, we can ensure that it does not shape policy in the future, and that insofar as restrictions continue, the steps are taken to basically ameliorate the effect of this gender repressed framework. So that is all I want to say at this point, and I'll pass you over now to Orla O'Connor, who's Director of the National Women's Council. Right, Orla.
Thank you, Pat. And I think the first thing maybe I'd like to say is that I think it's really important that this panel is happening. It's really clear globally and in Ireland that there are really different impacts in terms of the COVID crisis on men and women. And there's also disproportionate negative impacts on women in different circumstances. So, and one of the things we've certainly been really conscious about in the Women's Council is that there's been a real lack of gender analysis within the overall debate. So that's why I would really like to thank the Geary Institute and the organisers for having a panel on this, because it's something that we intend in the Women's Council as well to really raise the debate and the narrative and the discussion to heighten an awareness around the impacts on women. And I also think it's important, and I'll talk a bit about that, is it's also important that we talk about this so that when we are moving out of this and recovering as a society from this, that we can really take some really critical lessons from both how we have dealt with the crisis and also in terms of rebuilding our society afterwards. So I'm sort of going to split my piece in a way into two parts, and one is about talking about some of the impacts on women, but also looking at, okay, what can we learn in terms of how we move out of it. And I think, so, I mean, maybe just to start and the impact, and I mean, I suppose most people who are probably in this panel and in the discussion would know that the Women's Council, we're a membership organisation. There's over 190 members now throughout the country. And really over the last few weeks, you know, there's been a lot of contact with members working in different areas, whether it's local community groups, childcare organisations, the organisations working on violence against women, who've been feeding into us in terms of the different impacts. And we are conscious that in a lot of areas it lacks data, so it's all very, I suppose, live and very much what people are experiencing, although there is data in some areas. So I think, I mean, the first thing really, you know, which is pretty apparent, but does need to be said, is that, you know, so many of those who are working at the front line, whether it's nurses, whether it's carers, whether it's in our shops, they're predominantly women. They really are at the front line, and they're women, and they're also migrant workers as well. And I think that's important to say. So we're very conscious of that in terms of impacts. There is more data in other European countries about the impact of that, both on health and mental health. There's less of that data here. And we are seeing, for example, from some of the data being collected by UN Women, that in terms of health, you know, healthcare workers who are at high risk in terms of the virus are predominantly women. So I think, you know, the fact that we don't have the data here, but we certainly have the lived experience. Also, I think the second core thing to say, which you've mentioned, Pat, is the whole piece about carers and care and how care is managed in our society. And because we've come into this crisis where women are the predominant carers, then this has become, I suppose, a heightened situation in terms of homes across the country, where women are very much responsible for all of that care piece, whether it's outside the home or inside the home, and that's become much more difficult in this crisis. And it is having a significant impact in terms of women's health and women's mental health. Also, I think, you know, and we've seen it probably I suppose, a more concentrated discussion on this in the last few days, but in terms of the workers who are in nursing homes and also the women who are in nursing homes and the situation in nursing homes and residential settings and the impact that that is having on women is quite key. And we're also seeing now, and I mean, I do think that this is going to need a lot more analysis, but also in terms of the actual, you know, the health piece of the crisis, we are seeing now a greater proportion of women in terms of cases, you know, positive cases. And also we're seeing a disproportionate number of women in terms of illness benefit now from the data from social welfare. So the other thing I think is important to say about the experiences is the different experiences of different women. And I think that also needs to be a critical part of the analysis is when we're looking at impacts. So we know, I mean, we know this from our members, and we know as well in terms of pieces that, you know, that have been put out in the media, but the inequalities that women face and discrimination that women face, then when you come into things like a pandemic crisis, you get a much more increased level of that inequality. So the inequality. So just to give an example maybe of what I mean. So for example, like when we're talking about the inequalities that traveller women face, you know, we now have really difficult situations because of lack of appropriate accommodation coming into this crisis, that then dealing with that and also trying to deal with the measures of the crisis such as social distancing become near to impossible. And we're seeing the same things, for example, in direct provision and also in residential settings as well. And similarly, and Pat has mentioned it, and I'm only going to touch on it because I'm very conscious that Sarah will really deal with this in a lot of detail, but also very clearly in terms of women who are experiencing domestic violence, the message is about, as Pat has said, about being at home and being safe, and very much for women and children who are experiencing domestic violence, home is not a safe place to be. Women are at increased risk of domestic violence and harm, and also then their access to help and escape is severely limited. And I think one of the important things I would just say about this, and I think it's critical from all of the members in the Women's Council, you know, it's not a case that this crisis causes domestic violence. Domestic violence is about power, it's about control, and it's about entitlement. But what it is doing is heightening those situations. And that's why I think the government's campaign is actually very positive in that regard. That was just launched this week. Also, in terms of the issues, I think a core issue around this is the issue of childcare. One of the, you know, I think one of the things in this crisis, and it'll lead me on to, I think, in terms of what we do in terms of coming out of it, but it's very clear that childcare is an essential public service. And once that's removed, the difficulties that causes for everyone in society, but particularly for women. And we're also seeing how inadequate, in a way, the investment and the support around childcare has been. And that's why these new schemes have had to be put in place, which I think are really positive. And the National Women's Council has really welcomed the fact that the state has stepped in now to pay wages of the childcare sector. But in a way, it's shown how inadequate the infrastructure that was there. And the fact that, you know, for so many childcare workers, the majority of whom are women, were on such incredibly low pay. Really, you know, very similar to minimum wage. So that's, and I mean, I know I'm very conscious that that isn't all the issues, but I'm also conscious of my time. And I do want to talk about the piece, which I think is really important, is in terms of some of the learning. And we're not anyway at a stage, I think, where we can capture all of the learning. But I do think it's important to talk about the learning because we're also at a moment where the government is now preparing a new programme for government. And very much part of that programme will be how we move out of this crisis. So the types of things that the Women's Council is saying is, you know, I think one of the key pieces about this is the critical role of the state and the critical role of public services. And we must take that into the next programme for government in terms of how we rebuild society, that the emphasis on the role of the state has to be key. And, you know, once again, and I think this happens continually in Ireland, is the people are well ahead of our political leadership. I mean, in fact, that whole piece about public services was well recognised coming into the general election, and because it was cited continuously in polls, but particularly in the exit poll, just how important people saw public services like health and like childcare and housing. So I think that piece about the role of the state and the role of public services has to be at the forefront. And we know that women rely in a much greater proportion to men on public services and need high quality public services. So a good example of that, I think, and it's one of the things that we're really prioritising, is that some of the things that the state has done in this crisis in terms of ramping up our public service, be that about health and also be that about childcare, that needs to continue. And also the piece around the adequacy of our social welfare payments and the fact their inadequacy, which has been recognised in this crisis, that also needs to be addressed. And that's why, we've been, since the framework piece came out on the programme for government, we've been quite critical of it, because we don't think that it really is got the teeth behind the I suppose aspirations that it's putting out in terms of how the role of the state is going to be enhanced. So we're particularly highlighting the need for now a public childcare infrastructure. This crisis is teaching us very clearly that it needs to be an essential public service, and that's what needs to happen after. And similarly, there needs to be a real, I suppose, quickening of the pace in terms of the delivery of sláinte care and a universal healthcare system. Because that's going to be absolute. We know that that's critical, but we've also seen it, I think, particularly in this crisis, that it's critical. So there's some of the things that we're saying in terms of moving out of it, how we can place women at the heart of that recovery, and how we can build a more equal and a more just society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orla. There are lots of issues, comments, questions that I'd encourage you to begin to put them down through chat, and we'll come to them after Sarah Benson has spoken. And so, Sarah Benson, I'd like to introduce her, CEO of Women's Aid. Over to you now, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks also for the invitation to participate in this. It's a really interesting opportunity and really timely, I think. So I'm specifically going to focus on that issue of violence against women, gender-based violence, Women's Aid being a frontline service provider in provision of services to victims of domestic violence and abuse. I suppose I made some broad notes. I'm not perhaps as structured as the two preceding speakers. And I also want to address something that happened right at the start of this meeting. So that'll be a bit off the cuff, but I think it's important nonetheless. So, I mean, the theme of invisibility and violence and gendered issues in a COVID-19 world, I suppose what I would say is, before the COVID-19 world, we had a very significant issue with broad-based gender-neutral analysis and policies which directly impact both objectives to achieve gender equality, but also specifically to combat effectively forms of gender-based violence. And I would say that in respect of all victims, because a gendered analysis is required to be effective to meet the needs of both female victims of male violence, but also male victims of either male violence or female violence. And there is also the importance of that need to ensure a level of proportionality, in that, unfortunately, we are living in a global situation prior to COVID-19, which obviously has persisted in the current situation, where, highly disproportionately, those forms of violence that we're talking about, that we're working on, like domestic abuse, sexual violence, are perpetrated against women and girls by men. So it's not to disavow the experiences of others, but a proportional response, and one that actually addresses the different needs of different victims, because they can be different. And there's research, particularly in respect of victims of domestic violence, that's actually important in order to best serve everybody. So that was our starting context. And so what I thought was interesting is, and these are just thoughts, but we have had this traditional focus on the public versus the private sphere, and the women's movement has long fought to ensure that the private is public. It is a public matter, and these would be issues which disproportionately affected women, issues in the home, issues of care, such as Orla has addressed, which have been made invisible largely through a historic focus on the activities in the public sphere versus what happens in domestic environments. So in this current environment, I think some interesting things have happened. If you look at issues of violence and abuse, we have had a strong focus on, say, organised crime, gangland crime, these kinds of public experiences of violence, and huge resources channeled towards those and huge public interest in those. But now we have a situation where public order issues are much more focused on, dispersing people gathering in parks versus, these kinds of activities. And perhaps that has now created the space to actually focus on those forms of violence which are happening in the private spheres. It has become a Garda priority, very publicly stated that domestic violence is, in the current situation, recognised as a policing priority. And I'm just wondering if we now have a kind of a paradoxical situation that while COVID-19 itself and the measures themselves are definitively creating circumstances that hold victims even further in situ in abusive situations at higher risk. But and so while they are in many respects made more invisible by the COVID-19, the paradox is that the recognition of this is making them more visible in the public discourse, in policy discourse. Orla's mentioned the government campaign. So I just think this is an interesting situation here where we have, in fairness, a large level of social response to recognise the particular risks that are there for those in our community who are struggling with domestic abuse and violence in their homes. It is getting attention now that in a way that perhaps weeks before the COVID-19 it wouldn't have. So that is right and that is proper. I think the other thing that is interesting to me is that question of empathy, and we know that unfortunately, and we know this from data, but also from our own surveys with those who've experienced domestic abuse, is that the stigma on victims themselves, on survivors, still remains enormous. Despite some progress over the years, and now we have an opportunity for a level of connection and empathy with anyone who is living in domestic abuse situation like never before, because the whole of our community is being required to stay at home, being required to restrict our movements, being required to consider every measure of our actions against a benchmark which is around COVID-19. For a victim of domestic violence, domestic abuse, that benchmark is how their abuser might respond, and yet those restrictions are something that we can all now connect with. That idea that, well, no, I can't go out, I mustn't go out. We are supporting women who, even before COVID-19, were not allowed to go out. And so I just wonder, trying to think about opportunities here, is there an opportunity in this for us to connect as a society, as a community, with those who suffer domestic violence in a much more meaningful way, and will this resonate past the current situation? Before I kind of wrap up, I do also want to address some of the other areas of gender-based violence, and I think that was, I feel it's an obligation to do so. For those of you who joined this meeting late, there was an individual who entered the space and displayed child abuse images, video of child abuse images before we started, and they were distressing and disturbing. It was a female child, a baby, and I don't know what the possibilities are, but I do hope perhaps the organisers have some mechanism to track who perhaps logged in and reported, because full stop, that was an atrocious criminal act. But what I thought was also, the substance of it was, knowing that we were going to be discussing matters of gender here, some individual thought that it would be opportune to, in the most egregious way possible, display, this sense of male entitlement, which was the most appalling representation of male entitlement to the female body. I found it very jarring, but it also made me think of other women who I've worked with in my career who, in the area of sexual violence and sexual exploitation. And I would be very aware that of something Pat said, which is men's fun must not be disrupted. And I think some other interesting things are happening right now that perhaps are less in the in the public discourse than domestic abuse. But for example, the issue of prostitution and sex trafficking, you know, this global situation has shown now that that demand definitively is the driver of the commercial sex trade, because that has dropped off a cliff because of the COVID-19 situation. So, but at the same time, colleagues I'm still connected with around the world are reporting that there are women still being forced into you know, situations because they're trafficked, they are not being allowed choices. And also in terms of men's entitlement to sexual gratification through the commercial sex trade, there are like innovations that are happening which have very little, if any, regard for the women involved. And so, for example, the porn industry, and this is, I wasn't intending to talk about this, but that opener to our session really made me feel I ought to. The porn industry right now is completely capitalizing on the current COVID-19 crisis. Pornhub offered for free their premium service in order to, as an act of public service to those men who use their who access their online porn, which includes the kinds of things which we were shown, and also includes videos of women and girls who are trafficked, indeed boys, and their subscriber has gone up 24.4% since they have done that. And they've also identified, for example, that the peak time of accessing their service globally is now in the early hours of the morning. So that makes us think, okay, well, why is that? It's because women and children are at home as well, so they are waiting until they've gone to bed. So I think there is that question of certain components of entitlement to women's bodies being used in ways that are really quite insidious. And as I say, sorry, I wasn't intending to actually talk about that, but I think it's worth putting into the room, given that what somebody else chose to put in the room as a way to try and disrupt this session. I think it's very telling. But I kind of bring it back. I would like to, before closing, come back to where the opportunities might be in all of this. And Orla has talked about, you know, the programme for government and what happens after. I mean, COVID-19, this will end. We won't end up locked up forever. This is, you know, we have to come out of this and we have to take what opportunities we can from it. And so from my perspective and the work that Women's Aid is doing, I would like to see, you know, firstly, we will want to assess the impact, not just in Ireland, but globally, and see what did happen. You know, we will be counting the cost of COVID-19 in respect of victims of domestic abuse after the fact, because so many are constrained right now in actually telling us what's going on, in perhaps taking action or accessing support. But I also hope that we have this enhanced empathy and visibility of this issue in order that we can galvanize to action. There have been some really good collaborative pieces of work that are ongoing between statutory and frontline organisations. There's been focus, there's been some level of investment, but that has to be sustained, and it has to be reinforced afterwards in the programme for government. We need to have we have domestic and sexual violence now named in the prospective Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael manifesto or programme for government, and that's welcome, because it wasn't there before. I can tell you, in the election, it wasn't in their election manifestos before, it is now, and I think that that's telling. But also we need to look at a cross-government strategy, which is actually grounded in gender equality as an objective, because working towards gender equality is the core mechanism by which we will combat gender-based violence. And you know, so if we have that, it has to start with education. We have to look at those 3 Ps: the prevention, the protection, and the punishment. So the prevention of the violence in the first place, that has to start with our education system, the SPHE, the revised curriculum, to ensure that, you know, that we grasp the nettle and name those issues, but also, you know, help boys and girls to see each other in ways that are positive, reciprocal, respectful from the absolute outset. The protection of victims requires, you know, very significant investment in the domestic and sexual violence services across the board. And the punishment is around that accountability, but it's also around that social message that it is not the victim who is responsible for abuse, it is the perpetrator who is responsible. And that doesn't require just a police response, it requires a community response to actually name that and hold people to account in that respect. So I will stop there. I was probably a little bit more strident than I intended, and I think that was aggravated by that particular image that we started with. So I'll stop, and hopefully we'll have a productive conversation and discussion now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think it was very appropriate that you addressed that issue at the beginning, right? Because it is really completely unacceptable and does need to be, in a way, we can't just, there's a problem with the technology, but there's also the underlying problem as to how it can be dealt with, right? So, right, participants, lots of issues, comments, observations. Welcome. Can you begin? Can you begin to put through on the chat? If I can. Kath Brown has raised a lot of issues. I suppose the heart of them are the, perhaps in a way they impact both on, they're relevant to both Orla and Sarah. She raises the issue of isolation, of working at home, and the problems that are related to it, both in terms of isolation and in terms of basically technological harassment, as we have seen. And also then asks a very specific question. She says, women in the universities in the UK are getting rid of tutors. And women are like, because insofar as there's a movement to online, and now the message can be that really there's no need for face-to-face small group work, and women are likely, she says, to be disproportionately represented amongst tutors, and she wondered about the panel's thoughts on that. So you have the issues implicit there in her home working, and she says that like she is actually doing it while the kids are watching the TV, RTE, home school, and the tensions around that, and also the possibility that even in your own home, the possibility of harassment coming through on the technology, and the specific question on the tutors in the university setting. So yeah, Orla, please.
Yeah, just in terms of the isolation one, because I think that is a really important piece, and particularly I think as well, you know, definitely it's one of the things coming through from the members of the Women's Council are for like it is really difficult. And that has impacts in a number of different ways. I think impacts in terms of people's mental health, in, you know, coping strategies, but also as well, I think some of the messages that are being given out to lone parents. And, you know, today, for example, the Women's Council has joined up with lone parent organisations and children's organisations around some of the messages in terms of bringing children shopping, for example, which is reinforcing that isolation and restricted movement. But I think as well, I think the isolation bit also feeds into the issue I was saying about the care piece as well, that because, you know, prior to this crisis, women in Ireland are predominantly the carers, and they're doing all of that at home. So what we're hearing a lot from women is that it's then women's responsibility then, it's become their responsibility to then do the things like feeling, you know, very responsible around the homeschooling piece, but all of the care in relation to children now at home, but also then trying to work remotely as well. So it's causing enormous pressures, and those pressures then are even more difficult for women in different situations. And I think that's, you know, so, and I, you know, like I said, in terms of lone parents, I mean, I think what we do about that is, you know, again, it is about looking at, well, what supports are there for people right now. So one of the things that we've done in the National Women's Council is put up a whole piece on our website around supports that are available, and particularly we're going to be doing quite a sort of a piece of work in terms of people's mental health, because it is something that we think is quite critical in terms of this sort of isolation piece. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Orla. Sarah, any thoughts? Yeah.
I defer to yourself, but with respect to the tutors, that being your domain, in terms of the academic side, just one thing which I don't think we have data on in Ireland, but certainly I'm hearing from the United States, and I hope profoundly that this is not happening in Ireland, is a worrying, and this is just more through networks and a few media articles. I don't know if there's research on it, where employers are assuming that where a woman is working from home, where there are children, that she may have to take annual leave or use her time off in order to balance the work-life balance, but where her male colleagues are not, because the assumption is that they won't be doing it. And I was just really struck by that just in some pieces I was reading coming out of the United States, and I profoundly hope that isn't happening here. But I think it's something we ought to maybe be sensitive to and vigilant to, just if employers are saying, well, you know, you can't possibly be doing your full day's work because there are children in the home. Is the same thing being you know, I would hope it isn't happening at all, because we need to have that level of understanding that, you know, we're all in profoundly challenged circumstances. My own children are downstairs being schooled, but, doing something. But that really struck me, you know, and I hope that isn't something that's happening, but I think it's something we could all be vigilant to.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. On the tutoring, I think, yes, I do think, well, I think the whole managerialist, neoliberalist pressures in universities are, of course, being heightened by this COVID-19, and the possibility that universities will be challenged economically because there will be a fall off in international students, and so they will be looking for ways to cut. And I'm very sorry to say that the thought of cutting the people who are earning, in Trinity I believe now there are something like 6 people earning over 300,000, cutting the people who are earning over 200,000, cutting their salaries, that is highly unlikely to be the option chosen by executive teams in the universities. And as did happen in austerity, it is highly likely that it will be the more precarious, insecure, people, including tutors, that will be affected. And that relates to the next question, which has come in from Carly Bailey. She asks for your thoughts on still trying to get past austerity measures which disproportionately impact community, women, children, service providers, as well as individuals, particularly thinking of domestic violence refuge spaces. How does this present now? Sarah?
I might start. I know Orla would have something to say, and I'll focus particularly on the violence against women sector. I think, speaking for not just Women's Aid, but all the services, and also a huge amount of the community-based services who we all collaborate with, because we don't work in isolation. So many of the networks which came up through the community development projects, you know, the connections with those organisations who work to support particularly marginalised groups, traveller women, migrant women, others, we are all still crawling back out of the impact of the recession. And I can tell you that it is a very deep and real fear that while, you know, there's, you know, assurances being given in most cases by funders in respect of even like the current funding commitments, which are a shortfall to overall running costs. I think in nearly every case that they are sustained for 2020. We are deeply concerned about what's going to happen in 2021, because unfortunately the community and voluntary sector remains you know, the low-hanging fruit when it comes to counting the cost of any kind of you know, government budget deficits. So I think it's going to be critical that we have the courage to not just say we need to kind of hold on. We need to press for increased investment, even in the teeth of, you know, a huge, probably global recession. It's different to last time. This is a global situation. I think there's an opportunity here. I think it's a massive challenge to the capitalist system, but it's an opportunity potentially, in light of the fact that there are arguably radically socialist things happening, you know, across the world in terms of measures to try and protect employment. You know, so I think there's opportunities there to consider how we operate as a society, that we push back ferociously hard against any proposition of austerity as a measure to deal with this afterwards, and that we'll need to be really united in this. So that's my response to that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think it's an important point that you're...
Sorry, Orla.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think it's a really important point that Carly's, you know, bringing up. We know from our members that, and again, it's about the fact that resources were so depleted coming into something like this then makes it that so much harder in terms of being able to provide basic service. So we know, for example, for many of the community-based women's networks that will be providing a whole range of services in terms of support around issues around like violence, but also around childcare, around adult education, that they are really struggling to cope in terms of being able to provide supports because they lack the basic infrastructure because of issues around austerity and the lack of resources that they had. And that is replicated throughout the community sector. So I think, for us, I think there's two things in that. And yes, there has been a step up in terms of providing sort of emergency support to groups, but it very much is the issue, I think, that Sarah is saying around how we continue to do this when we come out of it. But also, as well, how can we be certain that that resources won't end up being cut further down the road? So I know that many of our members are really concerned, not so much about funding being cut right now because they are getting the supports there, but they're very concerned about the next budget and how things will fall out of that. So that's something I think for the whole sector that's going to be really important, and I think for all of the political parties in terms of making sure that doesn't happen. I also think there's something though really important about this in terms of we can see that the community and voluntary sector, that civil society has really stepped up in terms of providing leadership on so many of the different issues with regard to the crisis, and whether that's about direct frontline services and supports in relation to homelessness, in relation to things like domestic violence. So there's real clear evidence, and we've seen it in Ireland before in terms of, when we want to do significant things in this country, civil society shows, steps up to the mark, shows the leadership. And I think one of the things that's interesting, not in a good way, in the programme for government is that when what's being said at the moment, that when it comes to the development of a new national economic plan, there's no mention of any involvement of the civil society and the community sector in the development of that. It's something very limited to employers and trade unions. So there's really important learning, I think, about the role of civil society in terms of bringing about progressive change in Ireland, and that needs to be very much at the centre of how we move out of this crisis.
Thank you very much, Orla. I guess in a way this leads into a key issue. Obviously comments, questions, observations still continue to be welcome. But I want to really pick up on Orla's point. Like, we have seen the expression of support and commendation, I suppose, in terms of lighting candles, in terms of applause, in terms of recognition of the work of largely women and frequently in civil society. Across a range of areas. And yet the real challenge, as Orla is highlighting, is how do we turn this into real change beyond this immediate response in the crisis. Okay, the programme for government is one way, and yet in a way, because of the COVID-19 crisis, little attention is being paid to the programme for government. So are there other ways in terms of which we can convert? It's almost, I suppose, I think the scales have fallen from people's eyes and they can really see what the issues are, who the important people are, how inadequate, as Orla has said, for example, the minimum wage is, and they can see the importance of slow-entry care. But the politicians aren't actually, the last election showed a huge recognition of many of these issues, and yet we have the distinct feeling of Groundhog Day in terms of thinking about 2021 and the extent to which it could be crisis over, business as usual. What are your thoughts? This is a really, really hard question, but what are your thoughts as regards how we can avoid that Groundhog Day reinstating itself? And by the way, I may as well say that Dara Terry is coming back to say, absolutely agree with Sarah and Orla, community and voluntary sector, and with that the community and voluntary sector is still operating on the ground, providing frontline services, not having had their austerity cuts restored yet. So obviously, in a way, it seems ambitious and ridiculous to try and think about moving not only beyond the austerity cuts, but moving to a whole transformed social and political structures. And yet there is that flicker of hope that this might be possible. Your thoughts, Orla, and then Sarah.
Well, yeah, I think the piece about, so how do we ensure that we don't end up back in that sort of Groundhog Day situation? I mean, although it seems like such a long time ago now in a way, the election, but I mean, the election was, I mean, there were many things I think you can take from it, but one of the things was very clear, which is, as I said at the outset, was the public and our society's, I suppose, hope and aspiration for a strong public services in a number of different areas. And I think it is our role within civil society to really hold our politicians to account. And I think we do that right now in terms of the negotiations for a programme for government, because, you know, it's, we have to make sure that what people voted for does transpire in this programme for government, and whoever is in the next government, there is a responsibility to deliver to the electorate on that. And I also think that the way in which the state has responded to many parts of this crisis, which, I mean, I think is positive in terms of what I said about the childcare sector, around recognising that social welfare needs to be more pay related, so looking at that adequacy issue, and also, you know, really putting a focus on things like domestic violence and on the needs of on the needs of people who are most vulnerable. There are certainly aspects of the response to the crisis that is also not, I think, addressing, and we've seen it in terms of the nursing homes, but also direct provision. But so what I'm saying, I suppose, is that combined with what we've seen in the election to also what we're seeing now in terms of the response to the crisis, that there is a lot of positives, I think, to be taken from that, but it's about how can we hold them to account to ensure that happens. And that's why, you know, from our point of view in the Women's Council, I do think that the framework document is disappointing. It doesn't live up to that. And I think, you know, we have a responsibility to really, to be constructively critical, I think, of it, but also to try and ensure as the weeks go on, in terms of the parties that are negotiating, that we really put an emphasis on the pieces that are necessary to bring about an equal society, and the pieces that I've mentioned around healthcare, housing, childcare, for example.
Thank you, Orla. Sarah?
Gosh, it's a huge question.
Of course it's a huge question. Important questions are always huge. Why bother answering unimportant ones?
I think that word Orla was using there, hold, I think that's what's striking me here. Particularly looking at the power of the community and voluntary sector, of civil society, one of the challenges that we have faced, and particularly coming through the recession, but preceding that as well, is the chronic under-resourcing of the sector leads to a fracturing of that sector because it becomes competitive within itself. You know, there's that thing of not enough for everybody, and therefore people being put in competition with each other, and that's a real challenge, and that's something that I think we all know. But what I've seen, you know, and that's a natural thing in terms of, you know, where there isn't enough to go around, you know, everybody will, you know, argue their case, and that's right and proper. But I think what I've seen in the last number of weeks is a really amazing coming together, not just the violence against women sector, but certainly, you know, within the violence against women sector, but broader again, you know, the you know, childcare, health, others, you know, this coming together in response, people sharing, but also what's been very interesting, you know, Women's Aid works at a policy level as well, is that coming together to really you know, inject the views, the advice, the recommendations based on that frontline experience into those policy spaces. And that's coming now from even the smallest grassroots organizations, because people are, you know, stepping up and saying, this is what we need, and this is what we know will work because we have the experience here. And I think there's something to be harnessed there for the sector coming out of this, is that yes, the realities of you know, competition, all of that are still there, but there's something even bigger, and something perhaps we've lacked. You know, we don't have a union, for example, that advocates for us in terms of pay deals, things like that. You know, I would love to talk to the unions about that, because that you know, that's something that you know, if you feel you just have to lobby for your own organization versus an entire sector, having somebody do that, you know, that would be great. But setting that aside, I think what I see and experience daily right now is this level of solidarity, pushing for what systemically would help. And so many of the things that we are talking about are things that actually would systemically improve matters for our communities well beyond COVID-19. I mean, one example at the moment is, particular to our sector, is that while the courts remain open, for example, for protective order hearings, the reality is that many simply cannot get out of their homes to actually try and avail of them. And so we've been talking with other organisations, between the sexual violence, domestic violence organisations, around, are there mechanisms around court proceedings now, because they are looking at trying to do remote you know, modes of working, particularly in the criminal courts. Are there opportunities there that would, you know, make it easier for people to, you know, with absolute regard for the law, you know, some remote way apply for example, domestic violence orders? Now, if that were put in place, the reality is that before COVID-19, women victims of domestic abuse in rural communities already face these challenges. They were extant. The courts are inaccessible. So, you know, I think if we hold to where, you know, there are systemic changes, not just the investment piece, but procedural things that can be done. And I think that there's examples across all of the different sectors around how we could do things better, to act as a united voice in terms of picking those things, and pushing government, and to take Orla's point, you know, pushing for our reinstatement into those public partnership spaces that there were some examples of in times gone past, and say, well, you know, we're not just the icing on the cake here. We are the ones at the grass, at the coal face. We are the ones who know, you know, and if you're talking in a vacuum, then what you're going to come up with isn't going to be fit for purpose.
I think thank you, Sarah. And actually it segues very interestingly into the next question from Niamh Wilson, who basically asks for your comments on the invisibility of domestic violence workers as a workforce, and whether this can be used as an opportunity to assert this work as essential frontline work, while also recognising the tensions this brings. And Niamh says, I'm particularly thinking about the attendant co-option of organisations that come with state funding who promote a gender-neutral analysis. So obviously, in a way, it's interesting that you mentioned, Sarah, that there was no union, right? Okay, which is at least a very tangible way of having a presence as a group of workers across a number of areas. Anything you'd like to add to your comments?
Well, I suppose I don't know if Niamh caught the very beginning of my input earlier, is that a gender neutral analysis does not serve men or women well. You know, the issues are different, the systemic context is different, and so it is absolutely vital. And, you know, if you look at examples like Scotland, for example, if you look at their domestic violence legislation, but also procedures and policies, they are grounded in a gendered analysis, which then is responsive to the needs of both female victims, who be the majority, but also male victims in this situation. So, I mean, the short answer is I think it's vital, and I think it's lacking in respect of the formal policies within our health sector, for example. You know, they are objectively gender neutral. There's some recognition, I would acknowledge, within the actors in that system of knowing that it is a gendered issue, but that needs to be made explicit, because then policies, you know, will be underpinned by that gendered analysis. In respect of the recognition of workers in the sector, and I would also include, you know, others, not just those in the domestic violence sector, the sexual violence sector, the children's sector. I think that there is a lack of recognition, and there is sometimes that feeling of, you know, that there is somehow a diminished level of professionalism, whereas actually the opposite is the case. You have an extraordinarily dedicated, experienced cohort who have an analysis of the issue of domestic violence, of sexual violence, which informs then the approach from the very moment of contact with somebody who may be suffering in that situation, which is informed by trauma, which is informed by an analysis of understanding of the systemic inequalities which mean that domestic violence disproportionately affects women. So yeah, I certainly think that is something we should, champion ourselves, but we need champions outside of our own sector to help us with that as well. And with respect to the union, I acknowledge that there are unions who, of course, represent the workers within the different organisations. What I was more articulating is that there's a lack of one union to lobby around, for example, pay deals, things like that. We don't have that in the way that other, like, you have the CPSU, you've got the, so many other unions who will advocate to government to ensure that the employment rights, the pay rights are protected, not just protected, but restored in the current situation. That was something we were all pushing for up until this COVID-19 thing happened. And, and our workers deserve to be paid appropriately in the exact same way that those within the statutory health services do.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah,
I'm sure. Yes, gender
sorry, no, I was just going to say, I think two things on that. Completely agree with what Sarah was saying in terms of that, the gender analysis. I also think it's important, just in that conversation, is the fact that that's recognition of, and the importance of having that gendered analysis has really been recognised across the EU through the Istanbul Convention. So that's the Council of Europe Convention on Violence Against Women, which, very clearly is about saying to all of the EU countries that they need to have that gender-based analysis, that they need to have procedures, policies, legislation in place that are particularly focused at the experience of women, because it needs to be. And I think, it is significant that Ireland signed and ratified it. And it's one of the things that the National Women's Council chairs, the Observatory on Violence Against Women, which is where all the NGO organisations, civil society organisations who are members of the Women's Council come together. And it was an enormous campaign to get Ireland to sign and ratify it. And I think how we implement that and the priority that we place on that is really important in terms of recognising the need for that gender-based strategy in terms of how we tackle violence against women. And I also think, just on the second piece, because I think it's an important piece that Niamh is raising in terms of, are we at a point where, or have we reached a point where the frontline services on domestic violence and on sexual violence are being recognised as that core frontline services, and I certainly think we have, and that should mean, and again, I think it's something that we're going to have to try to hold our new government to account on, but it should mean that recognition also comes with appropriate investment and support. So we should be at a point come the next budget that services are not having to compete against each other for different types of funding, that it should be recognised as that core frontline service in the same way that we recognise, our ambulance service, our other statutory frontline services. So I think one of the things out of this will be very clear call from civil society around a much more increased level of funding, and that of course should include, proper wages for the workforce within it, but also proper investment in terms of the quality of services that are being provided that Sarah has spoken about.
Yes, I mean, interestingly, while you were speaking, Carla Bailey came in, Orla, thank you, saying, when will there be a review of Ireland's response to the Istanbul Convention? Do you think this might be delayed because of COVID-19?
I don't know. Grevio, which is the committee of the EC, which does the country visits and the country studies of the implementation of the Istanbul Convention, is scheduled, I think it's towards the end of this year, to initiate its first review of Ireland. But I mean, certainly Women's Aid would be pressing for no delay on that, because it's largely done through communication, which can be managed without face-to-face, you know, and certainly I know that ourselves and a number of other organisations are very interested in developing a shadow report, which civil society is permitted to submit on that. So I would, speaking only for Women's Aid, we would object to any proposal to delay that, because we would not see any reason for doing so.
Yes, thank you very much. Did you want to come back, Orla?
No, I mean, yeah,
Okay.
I would totally agree with that. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in a way, I suppose, I was thinking of the gender neutrality. I mean, in a way, one of the great ironies is that at a time that many of the institutions, including the educational institution, perpetuate the idea that the universities, higher institutions of higher education, are gender neutral, at the same time as the embeddedness and the mapping of people's lives by gender is so very obvious. And I suppose this is, well, it's so very obvious to a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old. It doesn't require academic degrees to see how people's lives are mapped by gender. And I suppose this, to come back to this amorphous, huge issue of COVID-19, I mean, in a way, this is what is so dreadful and yet has such potential about this appalling situation, is that it has thrown everything up in the air. All the institutional structures, all the taken for granted assumptions are all now up for grabs. I mean, it seemed impossible that the state would do what the state has done in terms of childcare, in terms of nursing homes, in terms of all the things which were not possible 6 weeks ago are suddenly possible. And so can we have another little go at this big question, you know, that in a way, the taken for granted realities have been fractured. The structures have been fractured. And yet, as happened after the Second World War in the UK, you know, this was all forgotten when peace returned. So what can we, or how can we help, not only, how can we help the participants? And I always think, you know, COVID isn't the only thing that ripples out. Influence, ideas also ripple out, right? If you assume that every person can pass COVID to, if the normal interactions are happening to 5 other people. So ideas and possibilities can equally move out. So come back to that really hard question, you know, how can we avoid really this moment of opportunity being lost and cemented over and business as usual return?
I think your use of the word possibilities is important, because, you know, for many of us in civil society, in the community and voluntary sector, one of the things we're told so much is that that's not possible, and that's not possible to do, and there isn't the money for that, and, you know, we could never do that, and so I think you know, possibility is a really good word, because we have shown what we can do. The state has shown what it can do and what it can do quickly. And yes, this is unprecedented circumstances, but at the same time, and I, you know, I would go back in terms of what I was saying about the role of the state. It shows the importance of the role of the state, and that so much of the way in which I think we've built our society, which was really about prioritising our economic needs and market-led needs over people and over the needs of people in society, that in a way that's been upturned now on its head, and it is about how can we move into that much more of a possibility space. And I think that is one of the things that's concerning then when you see something like that programme for government, which in a way I think brings us back in terms of where we are now. But I think it will be impossible to come out of this crisis and not have an increased demand from the public for so many of those really important things around public services. And I also think there is a very new conversation as well around what's sustainable and the environmental concerns that people had. And I know that in some ways over the last number of weeks, some of those concerns I think have fallen a bit into the background, but yet also what we're seeing from this crisis in terms of, less people traveling, and that it is having an impact on the environment. And it shows again what might be possible if we could reorganize work, for example. One of the things the National Women's Council was talking about was a 4-day week, which would have a substantial impact on the environment, and it's a campaign that we're also doing with Friends of the Earth and Forza. So I think there are a lot more demands, if you like, and not even demands, but ideas and thinking that was coming from civil society that we were told would probably be impossible, that are now much more possible. And it's about how we can build on that after.
Thank you very much, Orla. Sarah?
Yeah, I think I would agree with everything Orla is saying. I think that it struck me, Pat, when you were talking about World War II, because that example came straight into my mind when you were talking. And when young men were leaving countries in their droves in order to maintain society, suddenly state childcare became absolutely ubiquitous to support women into the workforce. And of course, the minute these young men came back, their jobs had to be reprioritized, and so it was removed in order to predicate the male workforce. So, I think the question always in terms of we have possibility, and if there are certain things that are employed now, or even even if they're just embryonic ideas now that are at least being entertained, the question should not be why we can't do it, but why we cannot do it, or why we would not do it. And I think right now we also have this really important, and I hope we hold on to it and we don't forget it, and it would be easy to do so, of value in terms of not just our social values, but who we value in our society. And right now it is some of the lowest paid workers. It's those who are keeping the entire show on the road, and they are the ones who are taking health risks in order to make sure the shelves are stocked, to make sure that our bins are taken away, to make sure that we are cared for in A&Es. And so where our values lie now is coming into really stark focus when we are talking about actual kind of survival, and I think those are things that we need to really kind of hold on to coming out of this. And I would be very concerned if things start shifting back to a purely economic focus. I think Orla's raised a really important red flag around who is to be front and center in the restructuring or the rebuilding or whatever it will be when we come out of this. And it will be so important that these values are carried through, and that the question why not is pushed harder and harder and harder, because now we do see possibilities, and we know there's historical precedent there. The example I gave was something that could easily have been maintained had it not been for an issue of gender, which was the predication of male employment over female employment. I think we've moved beyond that now. So now it is about, social sustainability, but really important that it has that gendered component. And you mentioned, around universities, and politics is another great example, supposedly gender neutral. It's not, because the actual way of working of politics is not conducive to, the gendered issues around care and, times of working, childcare provision, for example, so we can't just say you can do it. We also have to say we'll make it so that it is possible for you to do it, whatever that might be, in terms of women's roles in society. So yeah, that's where I'll stop on that.
Yeah, and I think just a thing that you said there, Sarah, which is really important in this, because one of the core things in terms of how we come out of it will also be women in leadership, and that is one of the areas that, while we're seeing small changes being made, they are very small, and they're happening at a pace that is not really going to bring about the type, I suppose, of equality that's reflective of society. So I do think that's a real core area, because in terms of that sort of key decision making across, whether it's in universities, whether it's in the Dáil, within every sector, that we still have that very low level of women's representation at senior level. And that's really critical in terms of the decisions that will get made around the type of recovery that we have from this crisis. I think it was really disappointing to see in the general elections very little change there. It looks like, in particular, if it's a coalition of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, there's very low numbers of women there within those two parties, both at national level and local level. So I think that issue is going to be core in terms of how we come out of this. And I think for us in the Women's Council, we feel that the pace of change is just way too slow, and that change won't happen automatically. So it's why we're particularly calling for quotas in a number of areas, with regard to politics, but also with regard to senior positions, for example, on boards. And I think that will be important. We need to really increase that pace of change to have our leadership reflective of women and men in society.
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with you, Orla, on that. And it is, of course, in a way, having women there is important. It's important symbolically, but of course, having feminists there is where the rubber really begins to hit the road. And there's a question that's come in from Elaine McGarry, and it's a very challenging one. What steps, she asks, can we take from home to support or help whilst we are not working? There has to be, she said, lots of people that have time and commuters like me that could do actions to support or help. I just don't know what those actions are. Elaine. Now,
sorry, Pat, did you say support or help?
Or help, basically. She's saying, what steps can we take from home to support or help whilst we are not working? She's obviously confined to the home. Basically, she said there has to be lots of people that have time and computers like me now, that she might have spent that time traveling, that could do actions to support or help. And I think she means in moving forward this transformative agenda. I just don't know what those actions are. And I'm sure she's speaking on behalf of a lot of people. And it's a hard question, but you know me, who wants to tackle it first?
Well, I suppose, yeah, I think there's a number of ways, and certainly one of the things that we're going to be doing in the Women's Council is to look at how can we engage more women in this conversation around what happens when we come out of this crisis and move towards it. And some of that can be small but effective measures in terms of, right now, negotiations are going on around programme government. It can be about contacting your TD, about saying, listen, we think it's really important that you invest in domestic violence services, in services around violence against women. It can also be as well in terms of, public childcare. So that piece can happen in terms of trying to put pressure on the political system for how we move out of things. And I also think it's about joining up then with pieces that are happening in civil society around trying to bring change. And I know that, for many of us, in terms of the types of ways that we might have shown our views, protested, that a lot of that was about sort of public gatherings. And it is about trying to find new ways in terms of doing that from our homes as well. And that's why, in the next months, we're going to be organising a whole series of different discussions on issues in relation to women and trying to use them to I suppose, heighten an awareness of the need for change in those areas. So that might be one way to engage. I might think of some more as well while we're here.
Okay. Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, it is the case. There is an opportunity now. There's two avenues of influence. One is our elected members to the Dáil and the new Seanad, but also your local authorities as well. So if you consider that, for example, accommodation, so if you have a refuge or no refuge in your local community, it is the opportunity, the contact lists are generally available online, is to start communicating with them as a constituent. if that's the case for your local authority or your local TDs, or just generally to all TDs and senators, just say, you know, this is really important to me, it's really important, and I want to know what you're going to commit to do about it. And, you know, I don't want to presuppose what your, you know, particular values or calls would be, so I would leave that space blank, but whatever it is, now is the opportunity to influence. We know from campaigns from Together for Yes, from Marriage Equality, from numerous campaigns, is that your local authorities, your local councillors are a core hub of influence, and politicians do pay attention to what is coming into their inbox, and volume matters as well. So if there are core things that you feel strongly must be a focal point for either the plan at local authority level or at national level, it's a really good opportunity now to start making those heard, and to ask them the questions specifically. What are you going to do? What are you going to, can I ask for your commitment on, you know, and then save that for later use.
Jackie O'Toole has just come in talking about the importance of a groundswell of collective mobilisation. And I suppose for me, I think the key thing is do not go quietly, right? I do think that the hashtag generation, the hashtag transforming Ireland, hashtag rocking the boat, that basically, in a way, just instead of muttering at home, mutter out loud, right? And that this is obviously each little point, each little pebble creates a ripple, and ripples turn into tsunamis. So we're drawing to a close. Obviously, I'd want to apologise on behalf of the organisers, and absolutely on my own behalf and on behalf of the speakers, for that dreadful incident at the beginning, for the pornographic image. I hope the people who have participated have enjoyed the session. I hope it has motivated you to not go quietly. I'd like to thank Orla O'Connor and Sarah Benson for their most interesting contributions. Thank you very much. And thank the organisers for making this possible. Bye now.